The night had a strange energy, the kind that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. We were at one of those private poker games, high stakes, high tension, the kind of night where fortunes could change with a single hand. The room was filled with the rich and powerful, people who thrived on the thrill of risk. But tonight, the stakes felt different. Emily sat beside me, her presence an enigma as always. She had a way of commanding attention without even trying. Her dress was a deep crimson, elegant yet dangerous, like something out of a noir film. She was the kind of woman who could make a man forget where he was, and tonight I could feel every eye in the room drawn to her, like moths to a flame. The game was just beginning, but I could sense the undercurrents beneath the surface, the unsaid words, the glances that lingered too long. Darren, the tech mogul with a reputation for being ruthless, was seated across from us, shuffling his chips with a practiced ease. To his left was Malcolm, the real estate kingpin who had built his empire from the ground up. And then there was Blake, a venture capitalist whose smile never quite reached his eyes. Something was brewing, something beyond the cards. I could feel it in the way Emily's fingers grazed mine, in the way the men around the table exchanged looks when they thought I wasn't paying attention. The air was thick with more than just cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. It was charged with an unspoken tension that made my pulse quicken. As the dealer began to hand out the cards, I couldn't shake the feeling that tonight was going to change everything. It wasn't just the money on the table, it was something far more dangerous, something that would unravel in ways none of us could predict. The game was just beginning, but I knew deep down that we were all playing for something much bigger than we realized. And in the center of it all, there was Emily, her eyes locked on the cards, but her mind somewhere else entirely. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew one thing for certain: this was more than just a game. The game moved quickly, chips stacking high and tumbling down with each hand. But as the night wore on, I couldn't help but notice how calm Emily was. She played her cards with a quiet confidence, every movement deliberate, every glance measured. It was one of the things I loved about her. She never lost her cool, no matter how high the stakes. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. There was something reassuring about her presence, a steadying force in the chaotic swirl of the night. We'd been through so much together, ups and downs, good times and bad, and through it all, Emily had always been my rock. Sure, we had our moments of tension like any couple, but cheating? It was the last thing on my mind. I watched as she folded a hand, her expression unreadable. She wasn't the kind of woman who flirted with danger for the thrill of it. No, Emily was careful, thoughtful, always 2 steps ahead of everyone else. That's why I didn't worry when the men around the table tried to charm her with their smooth talk and easy smiles. I knew they didn't stand a chance. Emily was devoted, always had been, always would be. Darren tried to draw her into conversation, his tone light and casual, but she deflected with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She knew how to handle men like him, men who thought they could buy anything or anyone with enough money. I couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as I watched her hold her own against some of the sharpest minds in the room. She was on my side, and I trusted her completely. As the night wore on, the tension in the room began to shift. The stakes were getting higher, the bets more aggressive. But I stayed focused, confident that with Emily by my side, we could handle whatever the night threw at us. After all, we were a team, a strong one. No matter what cards we were dealt, I knew we'd come out on top. The thought of betrayal never crossed my mind. How could it, when the woman sitting next to me was the one person I trusted more than anyone in the world? I was all in, and so was she, or so I thought. The minutes dragged on, each one thick with a tension that clung to the air like a dense fog. It was well past midnight, but the night showed no signs of slowing down. If anything, the atmosphere had grown more charged, the stakes higher, and every decision more critical. The poker game was no longer just a game, it was a battlefield, and everyone at the table was a combatant, each move calculated, each bet a potential turning point. But it wasn't the money or the cards that kept me on edge, it was something else, something I couldn't quite name but felt gnawing at the back of my mind. Emily remained an enigma, as always. She had played her cards with a measured coolness, her face an unreadable mask that only added to her allure. Dressed in that crimson dress that had caught everyone's attention the moment she walked in, she commanded the room in a way that seemed almost effortless. Every smile, every gesture was perfectly timed, perfectly executed. To anyone watching, she was the epitome of grace under pressure. But I knew her better than that, or at least I thought I did. As the game wore on, I began to notice the little things, the small shifts in the way Emily interacted with the others. At first, they were almost imperceptible: an extra second of eye contact with Darren, a slight curve of her lips when Blake made a joke, a soft laugh at something Malcolm said. Nothing overt, nothing that would raise alarm bells on its own. But together, these tiny details began to form a picture, one that made my gut tighten with a feeling I couldn't shake. Darren had been watching her all night, his eyes lingering on her whenever he thought no one was looking. He was subtle about it, careful not to make it too obvious, but I caught it every time. The way his gaze followed the line of her neck, the curve of her shoulder, the way he seemed to lean in just a bit closer whenever she spoke. It was almost as if he were trying to draw her into some silent conversation, one that I wasn't privy to, and she was responding, maybe not consciously, maybe not even willingly, but there was a connection there, a pull that I couldn't ignore. Malcolm was no different. He had been quieter than the others, more reserved, but there was a predatory focus in the way he watched her. It wasn't just casual interest, it was something deeper, something that made my skin crawl. He was biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike, and I could see the gears turning in his mind as he studied her. And then there was Blake, whose charm was as effortless as it was insidious. He had been laying it on thick all night, joking, flirting, throwing compliments her way like confetti. Emily laughed at his quips, her smile wide and genuine, and I felt a stab of something in my chest, a mix of pride and unease that left me unsettled. I tried to push the thoughts aside, tried to focus on the game, but it was impossible. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw something new, something that didn't quite fit with the image I had of her. She was too relaxed, too comfortable with these men who were practically strangers. It wasn't like her to be so at ease with people she didn't know well, especially not in a setting like this. And yet, there she was, laughing and smiling as if she had known them for years. It didn't make sense. As the dealer shuffled the deck and began to deal the next hand, I found myself studying her, trying to read the signals she was sending out, trying to decipher what was going on behind those eyes that had always been so hard to read. But she was as inscrutable as ever, her face a perfect mask of calm and control. Even when she glanced my way, there was nothing in her expression to suggest that anything was amiss. If anything, she looked more confident than ever, as if she knew something the rest of us didn't. The hand played out, with Darren raking in the pot after a particularly bold bluff. He grinned, flashing a set of perfect white teeth, and I caught the way his eyes flicked to Emily as he scooped up his winnings. There was something there, something unspoken, and it made my stomach churn. I wanted to believe it was nothing, just my imagination running wild after too many hours at the table, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. Something that was right in front of me, but just out of reach. I reached for my drink, hoping the whiskey would calm my nerves, but it did little to ease the growing knot of tension in my chest. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the air growing heavier with every passing minute. I glanced around, trying to gauge the mood of the others, but they were all too focused on the game to notice the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Emily placed her next bet, her fingers grazing the edge of her chips before pushing them forward. Her movements were smooth, practiced. But there was a moment, a fraction of a second, where I saw something flicker in her eyes. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual calm demeanor, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I knew that look. It was the same one she got when she was hiding something, when she was trying to keep something from me. But what could it be? What could she possibly have to hide? I forced myself to relax, to push the doubt aside. Emily had always been loyal, always been someone I could count on. We had been through so much together, and she had never given me a reason to question her devotion. She wasn't the type to get caught up in the games people played, the manipulations and deceptions that others thrived on. She was better than that. And yet, as the night wore on, I couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between us, something subtle but undeniable. The game continued, but my focus was elsewhere, and my mind spinning with possibilities. I watched as Darren, Malcolm, and Blake played their hands, each one trying to outmaneuver the other, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Emily. She was at the center of it all, the focal point around which the night seemed to revolve. And I couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing a game of her own, a game that I wasn't a part of, a game that I didn't understand. I wanted to trust her, wanted to believe that everything was fine, but the nagging doubt refused to go away. It was like a splinter in my mind, small but persistent, and the more I tried to ignore it, the deeper it seemed to burrow. I glanced at Emily again, but she was focused on the cards, her face a mask of concentration. If she sensed my unease, she gave no indication. If she was hiding something, she was doing a damn good job of it. By the time the dealer announced the next hand, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a precipice, one wrong move away from falling into an abyss. The room was growing colder, the smiles around the table more strained, the laughter more forced. Everyone was playing their part, but the facade was beginning to crack, and I could feel the tension building to a breaking point. Something was going to happen, something that would shatter the fragile balance we had been maintaining all night. I could feel it in my bones. Emily placed her next bet, her hands steady, her eyes locked on the cards. But there was something different now. Something in the way she held herself. Something in the way the men around the table watched her, with a little too much interest. The game was no longer just a game, and I knew deep down that we were all playing for something much more dangerous than money. And in the center of it all, there was Emily, calm and composed, but with an edge that I had never seen before. The night was far from over, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever was coming next would change everything. As the night deepened, the air in the room grew thicker, weighed down by an invisible tension that was palpable. The game continued, the clatter of chips and the shuffle of cards filling the silence between cautious conversations. But it was clear to everyone at the table that something was brewing beneath the surface, something none of us could quite grasp yet. Emily remained the calm in the storm, her composure unshaken as she played her hand with practiced ease. I watched her closely, searching for any sign, any hint of what was going on in her mind. But she was a master at this game, not just poker, but the game of maintaining appearances. Even after years of marriage, there were moments when she was still a mystery to me, an enigma wrapped in that perfect, polished exterior. The men around the table had grown quieter, their bravado from earlier in the evening giving way to a more calculating silence. Darren, who had been so confident just hours ago, was now more reserved, his eyes flicking between Emily and the cards with a guarded intensity. Malcolm had lost his easygoing demeanor, his expression hardening as he sized up the situation. And Blake, who had been the most charismatic of the group, seemed almost predatory now, his smiles no longer reaching his eyes. It was as if they all knew something I didn't, as if they were all waiting for some unseen cue to act. I couldn't shake the feeling that the game we were playing had shifted, that the stakes had changed without my realizing it. And then, as if on cue, the moment I had been dreading arrived. Emily was dealt her next hand, and as she glanced at her cards, I saw at a flicker of hesitation, a brief moment where her mask slipped. It was so quick, so subtle, that I almost missed it. But it was there, and it sent a chill down my spine. I watched as she glanced across the table at Darren, then Malcolm, and finally Blake, each of them meeting her gaze with a look that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. Time seemed to slow as she placed her bet, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed the chips forward. It was the first time all night I had seen her falter, and it was enough to make my heart pound in my chest. Something was wrong, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, but it was there, hanging in the air between us like a dark cloud. And then Darren spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "So, Emily," he said, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin, "are you going to tell him, or should I?" My heart stopped. For a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. I looked at Emily, hoping to see confusion or anger on her face, but instead, I saw something that terrified me: resignation. She didn't even flinch as she met Darren's gaze, her eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. It was as if she had been expecting this, as if she knew this moment was coming all along. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, strained and tight. I felt a knot of dread forming in my stomach, a sickening sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. Emily didn't answer. She just sat there, staring down at the table, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. The silence stretched on, the weight of it pressing down on me until I felt like I was being suffocated by it. "Emily?" I prompted, my voice firmer now, the fear giving way to a rising anger. I needed answers, needed to understand what the hell was going on, but she wouldn't even look at me. Darren chuckled, a low, mocking sound that made my blood boil. "Come on, Emily," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "The cat's out of the bag. No point in hiding it now." My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. What was Darren talking about? What was Emily hiding? And why did it feel like the ground was shifting beneath my feet? I looked at the others, hoping for some kind of explanation, but Malcolm and Blake were just watching, their expressions unreadable. It was as if they were spectators in some twisted game, waiting to see how it would all play out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily looked up at me. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt and something else, something that looked dangerously close to fear. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It got out of hand." My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic rhythm that echoed in my ears. I could feel the room closing in around me, the walls shrinking, the air growing thicker with every passing second. "What got out of hand?" I demanded, my voice harsh and edged with desperation. "What are you talking about, Emily?" She opened her mouth to answer, but the words seemed to catch in her throat. I watched as she struggled to find the right words, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence between us crackling with unspoken truths that I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. And then, finally, she spoke. "The poker game," she said, her voice shaky. "Last month, when you were out of town, I lost. I lost everything and they gave me a choice." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous, as the reality of what she was saying began to sink in. I felt like I had been punched in the gut, the wind knocked out of me as I struggled to comprehend what she was telling me. "You lost what?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I lost the money," she said, her voice cracking. "But that wasn't all. They wanted more, and I didn't know what to do." My mind reeled as the pieces began to fall into place, the ugly truth finally revealing itself in all its horrifying clarity. I felt sick, my stomach twisting into knots as I realized what she was saying. "No," I whispered, shaking my head in disbelief. "No, Emily, tell me you didn't," but the look on her face said it all. She didn't need to say the words because the truth was written all over her face. "I am so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking as the tears finally began to fall. "I am so, so sorry." And just like that, my world came crashing down around me. The woman I had trusted, the woman I had loved more than anything in the world, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And the worst part was, I had never seen it coming. The world spun around me, a blur of faces and sounds that I couldn't process. I sat there frozen as Emily's confession hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, choking me with its weight. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel in slow motion. The woman sitting across from me, the one I had shared my life with, was a stranger now, a stranger who had ripped my heart out with a few simple words. "I'm so sorry," she had said, but the words felt hollow, as if they were meant for someone else. I couldn't even look at her. My eyes burned, my chest tightened, and all I could feel was this overwhelming sense of disbelief. How could this have happened? How could I have been so blind? The room was deathly silent, the only sound the faint ticking of a clock somewhere in the distance. Darren, Malcolm, and Blake remained quiet, their eyes fixed on me, waiting to see how I would react. I could feel their stares, their anticipation, as if they were enjoying the spectacle of my life falling apart right in front of them. I forced myself to take a deep breath to try and regain some semblance of control, but it was no use. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it was all too much. My hands clenched into fists, nails digging into my palms as I tried to contain the rage that was boiling up inside me. When? The word came out as a growl, low and dangerous. I could barely recognize my own voice. "When did this happen, Emily?" She flinched at the sound of my voice, her eyes wide with fear. "It was last month," she whispered, her voice trembling, "when you were on that business trip. I went to a game with them, and things got out of hand. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear, but once I lost, they gave me a choice. And I didn't know what else to do." I shook my head, the pieces of her story falling into place like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And what, Emily? You just decided to go along with it? You thought that was the solution? Tears streamed down her face, and she reached out to me, her hand trembling. Please, you have to believe me. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I did what they wanted, I could make it right. I recoiled from her touch, the sight of her hand reaching for me making my skin crawl. Fix it? I spat, my voice thick with disgust. You thought betraying me was the way to fix it? She pulled her hand back, clutching it to her chest as if I had slapped her. I didn't know what else to do, she repeated, her voice barely audible. I was scared. They threatened me, threatened us. I thought if I just did what they wanted, they'd leave us alone. I stared at her, my mind racing. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that there was some other explanation, some way to make sense of this. But the truth was staring me in the face, undeniable and brutal. Darren finally broke the silence, his voice calm and almost smug. It was just a game, man. You know how these things go. She lost, and she paid the price. It's not like she wanted to do it. I turned on him, my rage finally boiling over. Shut up! I snapped, my voice low and menacing. This isn't about the damn game. This is about my wife betraying me. And you, I pointed a shaking finger at him, my vision blurring with fury, you are just as much to blame. He raised his hands in mock surrender, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Hey, Don T. shoot the messenger. We didn't force her into anything. She made her choices. Malcolm and Blake exchanged a look, both of them clearly uncomfortable with where this was heading. They had been content to sit back and watch, but now that the situation was spiraling out of control, they seemed unsure of what to do. I think we should all just take a step back, Malcolm said, his voice tense. No need to let this get out of hand. Out of hand? I repeated, my voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. This is already out of hand. My wife. I stopped, the words catching in my throat. She betrayed me with you three, and you think this is something we can just walk away from? Blake leaned forward, his expression serious for the first time that night. Look, I get that you are angry. Hell, if I were in your shoes, I'd be pissed too. But what is done is done. We can change what happened. The best thing you can do now is move on. Move on? I repeated, the disbelief turning to cold, hard fury. You think I am just going to move on after this? Emily sobbed quietly beside me, her tears falling unchecked as she watched the confrontation unfold. I could see the guilt etched into her features, but it did nothing to soothe the rage that was burning inside me. I had never felt so angry, so betrayed in my entire life. You three? I looked at each of them in turn, my voice deadly calm. You think you can just ruin someone's life and walk away? You think there want to be consequences? Darren's smirk faltered, and I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross his face. What are you saying? I am saying, I said slowly, deliberately, that you've made a big mistake. All of you. You think you're untouchable because of your money, your power, but you are wrong. You've crossed a line, and I promise you, you're going to regret it. Malcolm shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were going. Look, we don't want any trouble. What happened was unfortunate, but it is done. There's no need to make this any worse. I laughed then, a cold, bitter sound that had nothing to do with humor. Oh, it's going to get worse. You've taken everything from me, my trust, my dignity, my marriage, and now I'm going to take everything from you. Blake narrowed his eyes, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. You're making threats now? You're in over your head, man. You don't want to start something you can finish. I met his gaze, my own eyes blazing with anger. Oh, I'll finish it, I promised. And when I'm done, you all wish you never met me. You'll wish you never touched her. The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Emily S. sobs had quieted, and she looked at me with a mixture of fear and something else, something that looked dangerously close to respect. For the first time that night, I saw the fear in the eyes of the men who had wronged me, and it gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate, my mind already calculating the steps I would take. This isn't over, I said, my voice calm and cold, not by a long shot. And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of my life and the smoldering remains of the man I had once been. There was no going back now. The descent had begun, and I was ready to drag them all down with me. The drive home was a blur. The city lights streaked by like smears of neon on a black canvas. But I barely saw them. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one darker and more twisted than the last. I could still hear Emily S.'s voice in my head, her tearful apologies looping endlessly, mixing with Darren S.'s smug words and the cold indifference of Malcolm and Blake. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but the tension in my body refused to release. I pulled into the driveway, the engine idling for a moment before I killed it. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos inside my head. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the place that had once been my sanctuary. Now it felt like a cage, a reminder of everything I had lost in the span of a single night. Emily was already inside, having ridden back with me in complete silence. I didn't bother to ask where she had gone after the confrontation. It didn't matter. Nothing she said or did now could change what had happened. The betrayal was too deep, the wound too fresh. But as much as I wanted to wallow in the pain, I knew I couldn't. Not if I was going to do what needed to be done. I got out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin as I made my way to the front door. The house was dark, but I didn't bother turning on the lights. I knew the layout well enough to navigate it blindfolded. My footsteps were slow, measured as I moved through the hallway and into the living room. Everything was just as we had left it, tidy, orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in my mind. Emily was there, standing by the window, her silhouette outlined against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. She didn't turn when she heard me enter. She just stood there, her back to me, her shoulders slumped in defeat. I could hear her breathing, shallow and uneven, as if she were on the verge of breaking down again. "Why?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The word was simple, but it carried the weight of everything I had felt since that night began: anger, pain, confusion. She didn't answer at first. Her hands gripped the edge of the windowsill, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do. They had me cornered. I was so scared, and I thought if I did what they wanted, it would all go away." I clenched my jaw, the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "You thought betraying me was the answer? You thought that was going to solve everything?" She turned then, her eyes red and puffy from crying, her face pale in the dim light. "I didn't want to lose you. I was desperate. I thought if I kept it from you, we could move on and you'd never have to know." "Never have to know?" I repeated, my voice rising with disbelief. "You think that makes it better? That you could just hide something like this from me and we'd be fine?" Tears welled up in her eyes again, and she shook her head, as if trying to make sense of her own actions. "I know I was wrong. I know I should have told you the truth from the beginning, but I was so afraid of what you'd think, of how you'd react. I was terrified of losing you. You lost me the moment you chose to lie," I said coldly. The words were like acid on my tongue, burning with the truth of them. She flinched, the tears spilling over as she covered her face with her hands. I watched her crumble, the sight doing nothing to soften the hardness in my chest. The pain she felt now was nothing compared to what she had inflicted on me, on our marriage, and no amount of tears or apologies could change that. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know if I can, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Just please, Dante, give up on us." For a moment, I almost faltered. There was a part of me deep down that wanted to forgive her, to find a way back to what we once had. But that part was quickly drowned out by the overwhelming need for revenge. The image of Darren's smug face, of Blake's indifferent gaze, of Malcolm's calculating stare, it all flashed before me, reigniting the fury that had been simmering since I walked out of that poker game. "I'm not giving up," I said, my voice steely and resolute, "but I am not forgiving you either, not yet. You are going to help me with this, Emily. You are going to help me make them pay." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" "I'm going to destroy them," I said simply. The plan was already forming in my mind, dark and twisted, but perfectly fitting for the men who had torn my life apart. Everything they have, everything they care about, I am going to take it all from them. And you are going to help me. She swallowed hard, her gaze searching mine for any sign of mercy, any hint that I might be bluffing. But there was none to be found. I was deadly serious, and she knew it. "How?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer immediately, instead moving to the small bar in the corner of the room and pouring myself a drink. The amber liquid sloshed into the glass, the sound sharp in the stillness. I took a sip, savoring the burn as it slid down my throat before turning back to her. "We're going to ruin them," I said, my voice cold and calculated. "We're going to take everything they hold dear, their reputations, their businesses, their families. They think they are untouchable, that they can do whatever they want without consequences. But they are wrong. And by the time I am done, They'll have nothing left. Emily's face paled, her lips trembling as she tried to process what I was saying. "And what about us?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What happens after that?" I looked at her, the woman I had loved and trusted for so long, and felt nothing but a cold emptiness where my heart had once been. "There is no us after this," I said, the words final and unyielding. "This is about revenge, nothing more. Once they redestroyed, we'll be done. You will be free to live with the choices you made." The finality of my words hit her like a blow, and she staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth as a sob escaped her lips. But I felt no pity, no remorse. The man I had been, the man who would have comforted her, who would have tried to make things right, was gone, replaced by someone harder, colder, more determined than ever to see this through. Emily collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as her body shook with sobs, but I turned away, unable to bear the sight of her any longer. I had a plan to set in motion, and there was no room for doubt, no room for weakness, not anymore. As I made my way upstairs to the bedroom, the weight of what I was about to do settled over me like a shroud. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my power, about taking control of a life that had spiraled out of control. And if I had to destroy everything in my path to do it, then so be it. I would make them pay. And when it was over, I would be the one left standing. Alone, perhaps, but victorious. Because there was one thing I knew for certain in a game where everything was on the line. You either played to win, or you didn't play at all. And I was done playing by their rules. The next morning dawned gray and cold, a fitting backdrop for the storm brewing in my mind. I hadn't slept much, my thoughts consumed by the plan I was piecing together. The house was quiet, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. Emily had spent the night on the couch, curled up under a blanket, her face pale and drawn. I hadn't spoken to her since our conversation in the living room. There was nothing left to say, not until the wheels were in motion. I dressed quickly, my movements deliberate, my mind focused on what needed to be done. There was no room for hesitation, no space for second thoughts. I had made my decision, and now it was time to act. The men who had taken everything from me, Darren, Malcolm, Blake, they thought they could ruin my life and walk away unscathed. They were wrong, and by the time I was done, they would know just how wrong they were. Downstairs, I found Emily still asleep, her breathing slow and shallow. For a moment, I just stood there looking at her, trying to reconcile the woman before me with the betrayal she had committed. She looked so fragile, so lost. But I couldn't have let myself feel sorry for her. Not now. Not when I needed to stay strong, to stay focused. I left her there and headed to my office, a small room at the back of the house that had always been my sanctuary. The walls were lined with bookshelves, the desk cluttered with papers and files, a stark contrast to the chaos of my personal life. I sat down, the chair creaking under my weight, and booted up my computer. The hum of the machine filled the silence as I opened a new document, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I considered the first move. Revenge wasn't something you rushed into. It required planning, patience, and a deep understanding of your enemies. And I knew these men well knew their weaknesses, their vices, the things they valued most. Darren's empire was built on a foundation of risky ventures and cutthroat tactics. Malcolm's real estate holdings were his pride and joy, his portfolio worth more than some small countries. And Blake's power lay in his connections, his ability to pull strings and manipulate people from behind the scenes. But they all had something in common, a public image that they carefully cultivated, an image that could be shattered with the right leverage. And I intended to find that leverage. The first step was information. I needed to know everything about them, their business dealings, their personal lives, their secrets. And I knew just where to start. Darren had always been the most reckless of the three. His appetite for risk matched only by his appetite for danger. It wouldn't take much to find the cracks in his armor, to expose the rot beneath the surface. I spent the next few hours digging, combing through public records, social media, anything I could get my hands on. It didn't take long to find the first thread to pull. Darren's company was involved in a series of questionable deals, the kind that could topple his empire if they were brought to light. Shady investments, insider trading, offshore accounts, it was all there, buried beneath layers of corporate speak and legal jargon. But it was enough. I saved everything. the evidence piling up on my hard drive like a ticking time bomb. This was just the beginning, the first step in a plan that would bring Darren to his knees. But I couldn't stop there. Malcolm and Blake would be next, their own secrets waiting to be uncovered, their own lives waiting to be dismantled piece by piece. My phone buzzed on the desk, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced at the screen, an unknown number. For a moment, I hesitated, my finger hovering over the accept button. But something told me to answer, a gut feeling that this was important. "Hello?" I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside me. There was a pause on the other end, a moment of silence that stretched out uncomfortably. Then a voice, low and smooth, came through the line. "You're making a mistake," the voice said. It was male, calm, but with an undercurrent of menace that set my nerves on edge. I frowned, my grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" "You know who I am," the voice replied, almost amused. "And you know what you are doing is dangerous. You need to stop, before things get out of hand." My mind raced, trying to place the voice. It wasn't Darren or Malcolm or Blake, but it was someone connected to them, someone who knew what I was planning, who had been watching me. "Is this a threat?" I asked, my voice cold and unyielding. "Call it what you want," the voice said, still infuriatingly calm. "But you are playing with fire, and you're going to get burned. Walk away now while you still can." I felt a surge of anger, my pulse quickening. "I'm not afraid of you," I said, my voice firm, "and I'm not going to stop, not until they've paid for what they've done." There was a long silence on the other end, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Then the voice spoke again, colder this time, more serious. "You are making a big mistake," he said. "And if you keep pushing, you're going to find out just how big." The line went dead, the dial tone buzzing in my ear. I stared at the phone, my mind whirling. Someone knew what I was up to, someone who didn't want me to go through with it. But that only strengthened my resolve. If they were trying to scare me off, it meant I was on the right track. I put the phone down and turned back to the computer, my determination hardening into something sharper, something more dangerous. They wanted to play games, fine. But I wasn't going to be the one who lost. The next step was finding a way to get close to them, to infiltrate their lives and gather the information I needed. And for that, I needed Emily. I found her in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She looked up when I entered, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. "I need your help," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. She nodded slowly, her voice small. "What do you need me to do?" "You're going to get close to them again," I said, watching her reaction carefully. "You're going to act like everything is fine, like nothing has changed. And you're going to get me the information I need to destroy them." Her eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "You want me to what?" "You heard me," I said, my voice firm. "They trust you, or at least they think they do. You're going to use that to our advantage. Get them to let their guard down, find out what they're hiding, and bring it to me." She stared at me, her hands shaking as she gripped the edge of the counter. "And if they find out, they won tea," I said, the confidence in my voice masking the doubt that gnawed at me. "Because you are going to be careful. You are going to do exactly what I tell you, and no one will suspect a thing." Emily looked away, her face pale. "This is dangerous," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You are asking me to betray them, to play along with their games. I'm asking you to make up for what you did," I interrupted, my voice cold. "You want to fix this. You want to make things right. Then do what I'm asking. Help me take them down." She didn't answer right away, her eyes searching mine for any sign of leniency. But there was none to be found. I was beyond that now, too consumed by the need for revenge to feel anything else. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll do it." "Good," I said, my tone leaving no room for doubt. "We start tonight." As I left her standing in the kitchen, a plan already forming in my mind, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction settle over me. This was the beginning of the end for them, and for everything they had built. They had taken everything from me, and now it was my turn. I would dismantle their lives piece by piece, and I wouldn't stop until they were left with nothing. The trap was set, and the game was on. Night fell quickly, wrapping the city in a blanket of darkness that seemed fitting for what was about to unfold. The plan had been set in motion, the pieces falling into place with a precision that both excited and terrified me. I knew there was no turning back now. The moment Emily stepped back into their world, we were committed. Whatever happened next, we would have to face it head on. Consequences be damned. Emily had spent the day steeling herself for what was to come. She was quieter than usual, her movements slower, more deliberate, as if she were mentally preparing herself for battle. I watched her closely, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that she might back out. But she remained resolute, her face set in a mask of determination that mirrored my own. There was fear in her eyes, yes, but also a grim acceptance of what needed to be done. When the time came, I watched her dress for the evening, choosing her outfit with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. She picked a sleek black dress, elegant yet understated, the kind that would blend in perfectly with the crowd she was about to re-enter. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, elegant style, and she wore just enough makeup to highlight her features without drawing too much attention. She looked every bit the part of the sophisticated woman they remembered, the one they thought they could trust. "Are you ready?" I asked, my voice calm despite the tension that gnawed at me. She looked at me in the mirror, her reflection meeting mine with a steady gaze. "As ready as I'll ever be." I nodded, satisfied with her answer. "Remember what we talked about? Keep your guard up at all times. Don't let them suspect anything. And most importantly, don't forget why you are doing this." She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine for any sign of doubt. I won to forget. I walked her to the door, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. Part of me wanted to tell her to stay, to find another way to bring them down that didn't involve her walking into the lioness den. But I knew that wasn't an option. We were too deep into this now, and she was the key to making it work. As she reached for the doorknob, I placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. She turned to look at me, her expression questioning. "Be careful," I said, my voice betraying the concern I had tried so hard to hide. She offered me a small, sad smile. "I will." And with that, she was gone, slipping out the door and into the night, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the crushing weight of what I had set in motion. I didn't expect her to check in with me during the evening. That would be too risky. Instead, I paced the length of the living room, my mind spinning with possibilities. I tried to imagine how the night would unfold, what they would say to her, how they would react when they saw her again. Darren would likely be the first to welcome her back, his smooth charm hiding the predator that lurked beneath the surface. Malcolm would play it cool, his calculating mind already working to see how he could use her presence to his advantage, and Blake would be watching, waiting, ready to strike if he sensed any weakness. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. I checked my phone repeatedly, hoping for some sign that everything was going according to plan, but the screen remained dark and silent. I knew I had to be patient, had to trust that Emily could handle herself, but it was nearly impossible. My mind was a battlefield, torn between the fear of something going wrong and the anticipation of what was to come. Finally, close to midnight, my phone buzzed, the sound shattering the silence like a gunshot. I grabbed it, my heart pounding as I read the message that had just come through. "It's done. They didn't suspect anything. I got what you needed." Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by a surge of adrenaline. It had worked, she had pulled it off, and now the real game could begin. I typed out a quick response, my fingers trembling slightly as I hit send. "Good, come home. We'll go over everything when you get here." I set the phone down, my mind already racing ahead to the next step. Whatever information Emily had gathered tonight would be the key to taking them down. With it, I could finally expose them for what they were, destroy their carefully crafted facades, and watch as their lives crumbled around them. But as the minutes ticked by, the initial rush of adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a nagging sense of unease. Something wasn't too right. The message had been too brief, too impersonal. Emily knew how important this was, how much I needed to know every detail, and yet she had said so little. I tried to push the doubt aside, reminding myself that she had been under immense pressure, that she had likely sent the message quickly to avoid arousing suspicion. But the unease persisted, gnawing at me like a splinter in my mind. When I heard the front door open, I sprang to my feet, my pulse quickening. Emily stepped inside, her face pale, her eyes haunted. She looked like she had been through hell, her usual composure shattered. "What happened?" I asked, my voice sharp with concern. She didn't answer immediately, instead walking past me into the living room and sinking onto the couch. She looked exhausted, drained. as if the weight of the evening had finally caught up with her. "Emily," I said more gently, moving to sit beside her. "What happened?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that made my chest tighten. "They didn't suspect anything," she said quietly. "But it wasn't easy. They are more dangerous than you think." I frowned, the unease growing stronger. "What do you mean?" She shook her head as if trying to clear away the memories of the night. "They are on edge. Darren especially. He was different, more paranoid. He kept asking me questions, trying to figure out why I came back. He suspects something. I know it," I cursed under my breath. Darren had always been the most unpredictable of the three, the one most likely to lash out if he felt cornered. "But you got the information?" She nodded, reaching into her purse and pulling out a small USB drive. "Everything you need is on here. Bank records, emails, documents, enough to ruin them all." I took the drive from her, my fingers brushing against hers. She was trembling, and I could see the fear in her eyes, the fear that had been with her all night. "Thank you," I said, my voice sincere. "I know this wasn't easy for you." She looked down, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, my voice hardening with resolve. "We finish this. They want to know what hit them." Emily nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the lingering fear that something would go wrong. I reached out, taking her hand in mine, trying to offer her some reassurance. "It is almost over," I said softly. "We are going to make it through this." But even as I said the words, the unease continued to gnaw at me. Something still felt off, like a piece of the puzzle was missing, something crucial that I couldn't quite see. But I pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the task at hand. We were too close now to let doubt creep in. There would be time for reflection later once it was all over. For now, there was only one thing left to do, and I was going to make damn sure it was done right. The night was dark and still, the kind of silence that comes just before a storm. I sat in my office, the USB drive Emily had given me plugged into my computer. The screen glowed with the incriminating databank records, emails, and documents that detailed the dirty dealings of Darren, Malcolm, and Blake. It was everything I needed to destroy them, to tear down the empires they had built on lies and manipulation. But even as I looked at the evidence, the unease I had felt since Emily S. return lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Emily was upstairs, asleep, or at least I assumed she was. She had been distant since she came home, her face pale and drawn, her eyes haunted by something she hadn't shared with me. I had tried to reassure her, to tell her that everything would be over soon, but she had only nodded, her gaze distant, as if she were already somewhere else. As I clicked through the files, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Emily, short and to the point. "I'm sorry." My heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. I shot up from my chair and ran upstairs, dread clawing at my insides. I pushed open the bedroom door, my breath catching in my throat. Emily was lying on the bed, her eyes closed, her face peaceful, but there was something off, something that made my blood run cold. On the nightstand beside her, an empty bottle of pills lay discarded, the cap removed, the contents gone. A glass of water, half empty, sat beside it. For a moment, I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The reality of what I was seeing didn't fully register, but then slowly, it began to sink in. Emily was dead. I walked to the bed, my movements slow and deliberate, as if in a dream. I reached out, my hand brushing against her cheek. It was cold, lifeless. She was gone. I stared down at her, waiting for the flood of emotions I knew should be coming. Grief, anger, despair, something, anything. But there was nothing, just an emptiness, a hollow space where my feelings should have been. I had lost her long before this moment, back when she had made the choice to betray me. Her death was just the final, inevitable consequence of everything that had come before. I sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the woman I had once loved, now just a shell of who she had been. The pain I had expected never came. Instead, there was a strange sense of calm, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The war was over, the fight done. She had made her choice, and now she was free from the consequences of it all. I stood up, the room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. I walked to the window and looked out at the night, the world outside still and quiet, unaware of the life that had just ended inside these walls. The storm I had been waiting for never came. The night remained peaceful, serene, a sharp contrast to the turmoil that had consumed the past few weeks of my life. I turned away from the window and walked back to my office, closing the door behind me. The computer screen still glowed with the evidence of the men who had wronged me, but I felt no urgency, no need to act. Emily's death had brought with it a strange clarity, a realization that the revenge I'd been so desperate for no longer mattered. The pain, the anger, the desire for vengeance, it was all gone, evaporated in the face of the finality of her death. I knew then that I didn't need to destroy them. They were already doomed by their own actions, their own choices. And I was free from the burden of revenge, free from the pain of betrayal, free from the life I had once thought was my only path. I shut down the computer, pulled out the USB drive, and slipped it into a drawer, locking it away. It no longer had any power over me. The storm had passed, and with it, so had my need for retribution. I was calm, at peace. The following days passed in a blur. I called the authorities, went through the motions of explaining what had happened. Emily's death was ruled a suicide, no foul play, no questions asked. I handled the funeral arrangements with the same detached efficiency, making sure everything was taken care of, but feeling none of the sorrow I knew others expected of me. I was done feeling, done caring. When it was over, I sold the house, packed up what little I wanted to keep, and moved to a quiet town far from the memories of the life I had left behind. I bought a small house on the edge of a lake surrounded by trees, where the only sounds were the wind through the leaves and the gentle lapping of water against the shore. It was the perfect place to start over, to live a life of solitude and peace. In the years that followed, I found a strange kind of happiness in my new life. I spent my days fishing, reading, enjoying the simple pleasures that I'd once taken for granted. There were no more schemes, no more plots for revenge. The men who had destroyed my life were forgotten, their fates irrelevant to me now. Whatever happened to them, it was their own doing. As for Emily, I rarely thought of her. When I did, it was with a sense of detachment, as if she were a character in a story I had read long ago. Her death had freed me, and for that, I was grateful. The past was a distant memory, and I was finally at peace. In the end, I had won, not by destroying them, but by letting go, by choosing to live a life free of the anger and pain that had once consumed me. I had found something far more valuable than revenge. I had found peace. And that, I realized, was the true victory.